Välkomna till Utrikesmagasinets podd med mig, Bitte, Hammargren. Min gäst idag är Jan Manners, professor i Köpenhamn, bosatt i Sverige, men med ett ursprung i Storbritannien, och temat för dagen är Brexit. Risken för att britterna i folkomröstningen kommer att rösta för ett utträde ur EU. Welcome to Jan Manners, Professor of Political Science at Copenhagen University. You are a real European, one could say. You're born in the United Kingdom, English?
That's correct, yes.
And you teach in Copenhagen, Denmark?
Yes.
And you have a Swedish citizenship?
And I live in Sweden, yes. So I'm one of the people that I think experiences firsthand what it means to work within the EU. Some of the benefits and potentially some of the costs of doing that on a daily basis.
And I know you mentioned that you've been commuting on the train between Copenhagen and Malmö where last year where there were thousands of refugees every day.
That's correct, yeah. It was a real wake-up call, I think, to the human scale of the humanitarian crisis and the extent to which we were not generally looking at welfare-grabbing economic migrants, but indeed very, very genuine and very traumatized refugees from conflict primarily in Syria and Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Afghanistan. And the small families and individual little groups of boys that I witnessed on the train firsthand every day, I think stand as testament to the extent to which we cannot simply have a conversation about the EU without having a conversation about the EU in the world.
Mm-hmm. And yet the referendum in the UK about being a member or not within the European Union has a lot to do with the sense of foreigners invading the United Kingdom?
Yeah, that's certainly a discourse. I mean, the expansion of both immigration and emigration into the UK over the last 20-25 years is quite remarkable. It is primarily a feature of the forces of globalization, of which the UK and to a lesser extent the EU has been an engine. It is part of the economic success story of the UK that it has been able to send UK citizens around the world, like myself, but also that it has been able to receive non-UK and non-EU nationals, as well as EU nationals, as part of the engine of economic development within the UK. It's just one side of the story. It is not primarily a story about refugees, as Sweden is. It is a story about economic migration, about skilled and unskilled migration, of which the EU story is just one small part.
I heard you talking about the No campaign in the United Kingdom as speaking about the old England, the past, not the future. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, it's the Leave campaign. There is an aspect of the Leave campaign, like so many what some would call traditionalist, nationalist, xenophobic parties around Europe, which are in the ascendancy today. And they use a certain language, a certain discourse, which reflects and plays upon an image of the country as it was. And in the UK, that image is often of Great Britain as it was, often in the wartime or post-wartime period of the 1940s and the 1950s. And the extent to which at that time the image, so it goes, was the golden age of Britishness. And that at that time there weren't Europe and there wasn't foreigners and everyone was the same. It was the great British community, and it is a construction of reality. The British Empire was from 1945 in decline, but it was an important feature of Britishness that it was the metropole of an empire. So much of the migration into the UK has been a partial effect of post-colonial politics. And the UK was never the homogenous society in which so many project onto it. You know, the advent of Welsh and Scottish nationalists as well as Irish nationalism is not a new event. It is simply one that traditionalists and nationalists have chosen to forget. But Britain is not unique in this respect. all right-wing and far right-wing groups and parties across the EU play on this construction of reality, and it is, in some respects, it's one that resonates, or at least provides a romanticised future by looking backwards, but it is often in no way grounded in reality.
But the populists in many countries have sort of grabbed the narrative in these days, and you also see similarities between Donald Trump and the Leave campaign.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, there are some very simple explanations, as I covered in the lecture earlier, of why this is the case. One is the extent to which the vulnerable within society feel that they don't have the same degree of trust, of inclusion within that society. So one of the side effects of globalization, and to a lesser extent accompanying that Europeanization, is not everyone has benefited in the same way from these changing forces. And this has led to growing inequality. It has, in many cases, led to growing exclusion of certain sectors of society. And in Europe, this is undoubtedly industrial communities, industrial occupations, and with them some activities associated with industrial. So we are basically a post-industrial society, broadly speaking. And so this has negative consequences for certain groups, certain societies, and certain communities. And we dismiss those consequences too easily. But the extent to which the far right and populist parties appeal to those communities is something that we've not taken seriously enough.
And those who want to remain within the European Union have not maybe addressed the grievances of those who felt they've lost on globalization or EU membership properly.
I mean, I think that's correct, and you can see this far more clearly. You asked me about living in Sweden and working in Denmark if you are a UK citizen. You can see this a lot more clearly if you stand outside of a society. One of the merits of emigrating, or immigrating as I have, is you can look back on other societies and see what is going on, see the extent to which, yes, there's this projection of a successful British economy, but there's also the residue of, in particular, the after effects of Thatcherism in the UK, which is the deindustrialisation of northern cities. The exclusion of vulnerable groups, many of whom pass intergenerational inequality through the families, and the extent to which this is just seen as kind of a residue or a side effect that is to be ignored. That cannot be the future of these societies, and it cannot be the future of the EU. We cannot ignore that European integration is both a success story, but it is a success story that doesn't touch and doesn't reach far enough into the societies of the EU.
I know you also mentioned that there are striking similarities between the United Kingdom and countries like Denmark and Britain in the way we are sort of half-hearted Europeans.
Yes, yes and no. There are similarities in the extent to which Sweden, Denmark and the UK don't see themselves as having the same post-war experience or even wartime experience as the so-called core group of Eurozone countries. Now there's an element of truth to this, but it's a half-truth. All of these countries, Sweden, Denmark and the UK, participated in some way in the events of the Second World War and the consequences of the post-war period, and certainly the events that led to the Second World War. But I think the major differences are the extent to which different narratives are told of what does this mean for societies. The Swedish and the Danish economy are not that similar to the UK economy. They have not deindustrialised to the same extent. The Swedish economy is far more mixed. The Danish economy is far more reliant on direct trading relations with the rest of the Eurozone. So there are similarities and there are differences. And the opt-outs, there are similarities and differences. So yes, the UK has an opt-out, but one of its opt-outs is on Schengen, which is very difficult to imagine how exactly that would work, for instance, between two members of the Nordic Council, Denmark and Sweden, who hypothetically should still have free movement between members of the Nordic Council. So yeah, I mean, countries that are or perceive themselves to be somewhat peripheral to the core of Europe, but in some ways, some aspects of this are illusionary, and certainly the retention of relatively high levels of welfare, relatively high levels of trust, relatively high levels of inclusion in Denmark and Sweden are quite different to the United Kingdom.
It's very hard to foresee what a Brexit, or as you call it, a Nexit scenario would mean. And I know that you could speak at length about this, but if you would just mention a few possible scenarios here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've been talking in terms of three scenarios. One is for the UK to imitate a sort of a Norwegian position, which is to try and regain access to the single market, which is critical for UK services, the most important sector of the UK economy. But the Leave campaign has basically ruled this out because it does not want free movement of people. So the second scenario is a free trade agreement or free trade area, in some ways imitating aspects of Switzerland or Turkey or even Canada. The advantage of this would be that there wouldn't be the necessity for free movement of people. The disadvantage is it would be highly unlikely to include as much access for services as is currently the case. Interestingly, over the past few weeks, the Leave campaign have basically ruled out this position and gone for the third position, which is total retreat from the EU, an attempt to negotiate an agreement on British terms on the assumption that these would be to the benefit of the UK. And it's questionable whether that is possible. It is questionable, indeed, I would say it's unlikely in terms of free movement of people. And I think it's highly unlikely in terms of free movement of services. And that's 2 out of the 4 freedoms within the EU. Even if that were possible, the negotiations leading to it and the transition periods will take you into another generation of British citizens. Of that, there's no doubt. So, people are talking about, well, it'll take 10 years to figure all this out. I suspect it would take longer. And there are so many aspects of the British economy which are incredibly dynamic, far more dynamic than the Eurozone. That's both a benefit and a cost. The cost in this case is the high likelihood of Britain's status as the most successful destination for foreign direct investment within the EU will be lost very, very quickly, with lightning speed. The possibility, indeed, the likelihood that foreign operations in the UK, let's say pharmaceuticals, let's say aerospace, let's say car industry, would find it necessary to relocate into the European single market very, very quickly, would happen certainly before you could renegotiate or negotiate a different trading position.
So let's see if the voters will be aware of that or not on the day of the referendum. And thank you so much for coming here. I know that you are on the run and you have to catch a plane, but thanks for talking to Utrikesmagasinet.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.